I'm gonna stop sharing. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for Building Fences, Not Walls, Next Level Conversation on Boundaries. I'm Nikki Irish, the DC Bar Lawyer Assistance Program Outreach and Education Coordinator. We know how much energy it takes to show up in the afternoon in the middle of summer, so thank you for being here. We hope to give you some insights and to hold space for questions. If you find yourself wanting additional space to process what we talked about today, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Lawyer Assistance Program. It's a free and confidential resource, and there's information about it in the chat, or there will be information about it in the chat. So I have to admit, I had so many things I wanted to say in this introduction, and then I cut them all out, well, most of them, so we could have time to actually hear from our amazing panel. The one thing I didn't cut out is I wanted to say before we jump into this program is this gentle reminder, right? That boundaries are and can be uncomfortable, right? I said it, we all know it. I'm pretty good at boundaries. I've had 40 some years of practice, but that doesn't mean I still don't experience discomfort at times. I'm not going to pretend that I might not set a kind of significant boundary and immediately like call or text someone to have them tell me I did the right thing. So if you find yourself uncomfortable, it does not mean you are doing it wrong. And I just want to be clear about that before we dive any deeper. All right, so what do you need to know for today? You need to know we're going to have a conversation among the panelists and ideally also with the audience. We have with us today the two LAP senior counselors, Jesse and Sharon, and an amazing LAP volunteer, Nashara, a nonprofit attorney. We'd love for you to engage in the chat, come off mute with questions when the time presents itself, and as questions arise for you, you're welcome to place them in the Q&A box. We have the amazing Denise Permet, the LAP Associate Director, who will be managing the chat. And if you need something, please also feel free to reach out to her. Another thing you also need to know is we're going to ask you to take some moments throughout the conversation today to pause and really contemplate the answers to some questions we pose. We're asking everyone to make sure they have pen and paper or an open document kind of at hand, because the goal with this is to make you think a little bit more concretely about boundaries in your life. And we want you to be able to walk away with something to work from or towards, right? Boundaries are a muscle. You need to work them routinely or they have a tendency to atrophy. And there are times in our lives when we are too tired to work them. And then we have to rebuild the muscle, and that is okay. So that's my other reminder in here, right? Like journey, not destination. But with that with the pen and paper document in mind, I'm going to ask you for your very first task of the day, already only a couple minutes in. Can you take a moment and notice one area in your life that you feel relatively confident about setting limits and giving yourself what you need? Maybe, it's, do you get to the gym? Do you take time to make yourself a meal? Are you good about reaching out to friends? Do you get sleep? Do you take time to read things you enjoy? Maybe you go to church or take time to engage spiritually. Do you set a do not disturb on your phone during certain times of day? So I'm just going to kind of pause here for a moment and let you think about one or two things that you are pretty decent about regarding setting limits and giving yourself what you need. All right, so see, you're already setting boundaries somewhere. You've got some confidence. Now I want you to think about something difficult that you have done, something that maybe felt pretty intensely uncomfortable while you were doing it. And then afterwards, you're able to recognize the worth, right? That the discomfort was worthwhile, or at least maybe that you could make room for those uncomfortable feelings and that was worth doing. So I'm going to pause again and have you kind of think about that. And as you think about that, I'm going to acknowledge right now, you already know you can also navigate discomfort. And I really wanted to do that just to make sure you started the boundaries conversation right from a place of strength. So if everybody wants to kind of take a deep breath. We'll get present and we're gonna dive really right in. And Jesse, I'm gonna start with you. And I'm gonna ask if you can give us a little bit, kind of just like a very brief overview of boundaries, kind of what boundaries are and kind of why we have them. And for anybody that wants a deeper dive into that part of the conversation, we do have a recording from our last boundaries conversation, which is like 1.0, that you're welcome to check out, and we'll also put in the chat. Jesse?
So welcome, everyone. The thing you want to think about when you think about boundaries, boundaries are, whether you call them limits, rules, guidelines, or guardrails, they're essentially the limits and rules you set in your relationships. You set for yourselves within a relationship. There's a variety of types of boundaries, from physical boundaries, emotional boundaries, intellectual boundaries, material boundaries, sexual, as well as time boundaries. The thing that you want to keep in mind is that you don't want your boundaries too rigid, because if they're rigid, there's a chance you're not going to be able to form those emotional connections, and you're going to find it difficult to ask for help. But you don't want your boundaries too porous, because then you are in the place where you may overshare. You find it difficult to say no. What you want is your boundaries to be healthy. And what that looks like is that you value your opinion, but you also value the opinions of those around you. You know, you are okay with saying no. Even though no is going to feel uncomfortable at times, you're okay with it because you know for yourself, or even for this relationship, it's important for me to say no. One of the things, the analogy I like to use is like, think of your skin. You know, if your skin is too rigid, it's going to feel uncomfortable, but if your skin is too porous, it's not going to provide that protection that you need. Another thing to keep in mind, you're not going to have the same type of boundary in each relationship. The boundary that I may have with a partner or a friend is not the same type of boundary I may have with a colleague or a leader. So just recognize your boundaries are going to be different in each relationships, and that's the way it should be. So why should we have them? Essentially, it's for self-care. You know, when you don't have healthy boundaries, a lot of negative things such as resentment, anger, a lot of those things can fester in a relationship. But also it can also lead to a healthier relationship. If I have healthy relationship with someone, that means we both respect each other's time, energy. So it's not just for yourself, it's also you value the relationship. So I'm going to put boundaries into place in this relationship. One of the things we want you to really think of as I gave you those descriptions, is what are those areas in your life where you feel like, you know what, I have to set boundaries? What are those important aspects of your life that's being impacted because of the fact that you don't have boundaries? And the reason I want you to think about that is because, again, as Nikki said, boundaries are going to be uncomfortable. So if you always remember why you're setting the boundaries, that's what's going to help you through the discomfort. All of you guys went through law school, and I'm sure there's times in your careers where you're like questioning, you feel burnt out, but you always sometimes look back and say, you know what, this is what I enjoy about my job. This is why I went to law school. It's just recognizing that discomfort doesn't mean what you're going through is wrong. It's just, this is something new that you're doing.
Thanks so much, Jesse. I think that part is so important, right? It's so easy to focus on the challenge without really coming back to the importance part. So Sharon, I'm going to ask you a little bit if you can talk about how do I know kind of where and when I need them? And I also realized I just did not give the audience any time to think about this question. So I'm going to pause for a second because I got so excited. So I'm going to pause. We'll restart. I'm going to give you like 30 more seconds to think about why I want to set boundaries and like what the reason is. And then Sharon, I'll throw the question to you in a second. You're welcome to share answers if you want, if you think that would be helpful for yourself or somebody else, but we're kind of going to leave that up to you. You're welcome to share with, sometimes seeing what everybody else thinks can be really helpful, what their experiences are, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's for you. So we will defer. And then Sharon, I'm gonna ask you kind of, how do I know when I need them, right? How do I know where I need them? What do I need to think about?
Sure. I think, going back to what Jesse was saying about the feeling of discomfort, right? The anger, the way that it can manifest into resentment. When we don't have boundaries, it manifests in these ways, right? I think with clients, a lot of times we'll see it manifesting more physically, like GI distress, a headache, their shoulders are up and we want them to come down a little bit, right? And you have to check in with yourself to see how you're feeling. Also, if you're feeling really depleted of energy, you're not really saying no because you feel like you can't, whether that be at work, you're taking care of your kids or your parents and whatnot. And we aren't able to recharge, right? We just feel really, really drained. And when we realize that we need boundaries, when we have these physical symptoms, we know that we need to start setting limits. So I think listening to yourself is really the first place to know, when do I need them?
Thanks, Sharon. And actually, I'm going to pivot a bit, I'm going to continue, but I'm going to ask Nashara, are there any signals for you that kind of show up in a way that maybe you're like, oh, maybe I need to look at that right there?
Sure. Also, sorry, not to correct you now. I should have done it earlier, but
Yes,
it's actually
please do.
Nashra.
Nashra. Okay.
Yes, you got it.
I
Okay.
apologize.
No, you're fine. So some signals I feel like that come up for me are when I can't sleep because I'm thinking about work, or like I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like, oh my God, I have to do this for this client, or I have to send this email in the morning, like can't forget this email. And I'll wake up at like 3 a.m. like thinking about, I don't know, whatever it is that I have to do, whatever my to-do list is, whether it's work related or personal or anything. That's when I know like my boundaries are not working and something is going wrong.
Then now I'm going to punt it to the audience so they can take a moment, and I'm going to like literally time it so I remember to pause. Just for you, the next question, right, for you to consider is, how does it show up for you? What are your signals? What are kind of tells that you want to be able to pay attention to, that maybe you need to think about where those boundaries come in? Timer helps me. Right. So now that we kind of have talked about brief overview, right, we're speeding through. I'm recognizing, I'm acknowledging we're speeding through a little bit the front end because we really want to get to kind of the discomfort and the implementation part. So if there's something you feel like we're speeding past, feel free to ask a question, but otherwise we'll kind of keep moving at this pace, at least right now. So we've got this kind of, what are boundaries, why we kind of have them, right? We need them to take care of ourselves and to take care of others, essentially, and to take care of our relationships. There are different ways that they may manifest that we may not pay attention to, such as anxiety, stress, discomfort, whatever that demands, fatigue, whatever that might be for you. And then, so now we know all these things, but how do we actually communicate? Right? Like there is a point where it's like, oh, well, I have to do something with this knowledge that I now have. And one of the ways that we had talked about, we kind of talked about how to talk about it, right? But there is a book by, her name's Melissa Urban, and she's recently written a boundary book, and she breaks it down into this threat level. And I'm going to share my screen because I think sometimes visuals help people. That essentially there's kind of a threat level you should think about when communicating your boundaries, right? So this threat level is like green, right? It's kind of like low risk. Maybe it's somebody that you've never actually communicated this boundary before. Or someone in general who you have, who in the past has respected your boundaries. So you're not kind of elevated yet, right? There's like this low risk. You'd use gentle language, or kind of body language is like generous and kind. You're assuming the other person wants to respect your limits, essentially. And you typically do not do not mention consequences at this point in this green kind of threat level. All right, let's say you shared, hey, you shared this boundary on, you know, I don't think I'm going to be able to make that party tonight. And then the friend comes back and starts pushing. Well, I really want you to show up. It's really important to me. You never come to any, like whatever those things are, they start kind of elevating maybe a little bit and pushing back on the boundary that you set. Well, maybe now they're at an elevated risk. So they might be in the yellow category, where you might need to use firmer language. You are clear, but firm. So the way you use it as a follow-up, let's say to the green, or because this person has a tendency to not actually respect the boundaries on your first communication, right? This person is somebody who constantly kind of pushes back against your boundaries, but maybe they eventually get there. So they'd be kind of like at this elevated risk level. And when you're communicating them, you've done it a little bit more firmly, and you might include intended consequences if that seems appropriate. And then you have this red kind of severe risk threat level. It is because this person maybe keeps pushing, and or you might start at red because it's a person you have a history with that is just really bad about respecting your boundaries. You have very direct language. You're firm in your body language. You remain kind, that like you don't have to aggression or unkindness. Like I don't know the right kind of terms, right? But you can remain kind and still be clear and firm and hold the boundary. And you're stating consequences plainly and you're ready to enforce them. So it's somebody who continues to talk, like the easy examples, right? Or like kind of in family engagements or family spaces where they're like, you have essentially said, this topic's really off limits. It's not a place we're going to go. And the person keeps talking about the thing, whether it's when are you having kids or who are you voting for or whatever those, what about, why don't you have a boyfriend, girlfriend, like whatever those are, right? And they just keep pushing. That's the space where you say, you know what? I've said I'm not willing to talk about this. If you bring it up again, I'm going to leave the conversation room, hang up the phone, whatever that consequence is. And then they bring it up again and you follow through on that consequence. Because when you don't follow through, you've not enforced the boundary and the person will come back and know that they can, right, keep coming back. So that's kind of the low, elevated, and severe risk. And we just thought it was kind of a nice visual. Any questions about that before I stop sharing? Okay, then I'm going to stop sharing. So all I have to say, we're going to talk a little bit about different examples. So the first one is a workplace example. So workplace example, as an owner of a small law firm, I want to be available to my clients for emergencies, but also make it clear that not everything is an emergency and that most contacts should be done during business hours. So what is the best way for me to do this? And I think we kicked that one to Nashra.
So I can talk a little bit about how I do this like in my own job. So like Nikki mentioned earlier, I work for a nonprofit. It's a very small nonprofit. There's only 6 full-time staff, including me. So very, very small. And because of that, clients love like calling it all hours of the day and night. They just feel a lot more comfortable because it's such a small office. So one thing that I do personally, because I cannot handle calls and like at night or on the weekends or times that I'm not working and I know I'm not working and I'm also not supposed to be working. So for clients that I have this problem with a lot, I will like schedule a call with them and sit them down, talk about what constitutes an emergency and what doesn't, while giving like specific examples from their own like case and their own situation. So they know like what are appropriate times to contact me, and what are inappropriate times to contact me. This is not always effective, but this is generally like in the levels you were just talking about, Nikki. I think in the clean section, where it's a client maybe I'm not super worried about, but they've called me once on a Sunday night, and that's not usually a time that I work. And that's not a time that I make myself available to clients. So if that's happened once or twice, maybe I might schedule a call with this client and talk about that. Another way I've done this, I think this maybe could fall more under like the yellow level, is when I know I'm going to be out of town. This just happened like summertime. I feel like people are always like out of the office for certain periods of time. So leading up to me being out for a week and a half, like earlier this month, all of my active cases, I like sent very detailed letters and then had calls with the clients that needed it to talk about like when I'm going to be gone, what I am available to do while I'm gone, if anything, and what's going on in their case during that time, so that they would know and not feel lost the whole time, but also don't really have any need to contact me during that time. This really works for me in my field, just because there aren't a lot of emergencies in the type of law that I practice, generally speaking. So it doesn't really come up that much, but that's like a good way that it's worked for me so far to frame it, is make sure to work with clients individually so they know what the boundaries are and where there might be some leeway and where there isn't. Does that answer the question?
No, it does. And I think one of the things, my takeaway at least, is some of what I heard you say is that you are proactive in the boundary setting, not reactive. And what a difference sometimes that can make, probably both for yourself and for the client. They're clear of the expectations, and you're not carrying around the like angst of what might happen. Well, I've already told them. So most of them will end up respecting it. And if they don't, at least I've explained, and now I can refer back to like, well, actually, it doesn't meet any of this criteria.
Yeah. And I also think, just to like expand on that a little bit, being proactive, especially when it comes to clients, I think has been way more effective, because when I'm reactive, then I'm already like irritated because why is this client calling me this many times? Like, I've already answered all your questions. Like, I know you don't have more questions. I know there isn't an emergency because we probably just talked like 4 hours ago. Why are you calling me again? And so then I feel like I'm irritated. I'm not being the best lawyer that I can be. I'm not serving my client the best way that I can. And then the client's also mad at me because they're trying to get in contact with me. I'm feeling irritated. They're feeling irritated. It just isn't a recipe for neither of us to get along, I feel like. So being proactive, I think, has made a huge difference.
It's a great example. Thank you. We're going to pivot to a personal example, and I think Jesse, you're up for this one, but I'll describe it. What are tips for introducing boundary setting into an established relationships that previously had kind of limited boundaries, maybe not so many? You know, maybe addressing the mindset of the boundary setter and how to kind of soften or warm them up for the recipient.
Absolutely. I will say, first thing, you're never going to say to your friend, I need to set boundaries with you. We are not using the words boundaries with our friends or even if our family members. I mean, yes, there may be that family member you have to say it, but a natural conversation is not going to be, hey, I need to set a boundary with you. I think if it's not something that you have expressed a problem with before, acknowledge that. You know what? I'm always the one driving and I never really said it, but I don't want to always be the one driving. Or this, when you ask me about this, I really feel uncomfortable about this and I haven't expressed it to you. So if this is something that you have not said, acknowledge that. You know what? I haven't said this and it's really been bothering me and I want to kind of set it now. Because at least this is setting the framework is, I've never expressed this boundary to you and I'm expressing to you now because I want a change to happen in our relationship. Now, if this has been a situation where, as Nikki says, there is in the orange and you have expressed this boundary, this is the part where you start sitting down your friend or your family member and explain to them, I've really expressed to you, as Nikki says, I really prefer not to talk about my relationship, but you seem to continue to want to ask. I need you to understand that this is not a subject I feel comfortable talking with you. This is what I am willing to share. And this is where the guardrails come in. Maybe this is somewhere where to a certain extent, you're willing to talk about some aspect of your life, but there's a certain aspect that you don't feel comfortable. So I'm willing to talk, but here's the guardrail. I'm giving you the guardrail. This is the limit. This is what I feel comfortable talking with. And again, I'm using guardrails, we're using boundaries, but you have to try, you know that relationship, you know that individual, and find that soft, warm language that you feel comfortable with, but is firm enough for them to understand this is what I need for our relationship to be better.
No, it's great. Thank
And
you,
as
Jessie.
the last tip I would say is for those tough relationships where, as Nikki says, that is completely, every single time you set a boundary with them, they completely violate it. This is where you're going to have to be firmer and tolerate your discomfort and push back when they violate your boundaries. You have to articulate the consequences and move forward with those consequences.
Right, so our threat level, it matters. But one of the things I think I'd want to remind people of too is I think sometimes we get stuck in language, like what language should I be using? How should I be saying it? And then that becomes a deterrent. So honestly, if you're kind of feeling stuck, just Google it. Like there are so many articles and like blog, all of the things on language around boundary setting. You know, it's okay to kind of look at something and be like, oh, that's how I could say it. And then I use my own words for what that kind of language is. In the Melissa Urban book where I got the red, why can't I ever do green, yellow, red, like elevated risk, she has a ton of kind of sample scripts for each of the kind of threat levels. So don't be afraid to use your resources. I'm sure AI could probably do something for you too, right? Like there's so many resources right now. Don't hesitate to use them. Just make sure they kind of like resonate with you, like in your own relative language, so it doesn't feel so inauthentic, I guess is the thing I would say. And now for the last kind of self example, that means Sharon's up. So, you know, I have a difficulty. So the self example is like someone who has a difficulty saying no. I have this tendency to overextend myself. I take on projects at work. I take on volunteer activities. I never take my lunch. Those things where we have to set our own personal boundaries and limits. What are some thoughts you have on that, Sharon?
I was just nodding when you were saying Google it, because I have had clients that put into like ChatGPT, how do I tell my mother-in-law that I'm only going to be staying for X amount of time for Thanksgiving? And it actually is really helpful to give you like a start off point if you're feeling like you don't have the language for it. Of course, call the LAP before you do that. I will always say we will help you with resources, but that is an easy way to sort of get the language sometimes. I think also in terms of self, you know, I really like, Jessie, what you were saying about talking to a friend, right? Or having that relationship, because sometimes it's a lot easier to set a boundary with a friend than it is with yourself, maybe vice versa. But I find that it's hard. You're always like your own worst critic, right? And so like when Nikki was saying about overextending yourself, you probably don't even recognize it until you figure out, oh, I have had that migraine for a week, or right. And so I think the first thing really is figuring out and reflecting upon yourself. What are your goals and what are your values, right? Like what is really working for you and what's not working for you. And I think a lot of times with clients, I think a lot about when they say, you know, I just can't not respond to an email. Like I have to keep responding between 7 p.m. and 3 a.m. And so sometimes really just being compassionate with yourself and having an incremental change, right? If the goal is I'm not going to check my email on the weekends, maybe it's starting with I'm going to not check it on Saturday morning, right? And be consistent with that for a few weeks. And then just keep growing with that, right? And moving forward with that and seeing if that's working for you or not. It's really just a cost and benefits.
Thanks. I think the goals and values are what kind of stood out to me, is the importance of thinking about those for you. And then the other one is kind of, I liked your example of setting the small goal and building from it, right? There's the concept that I always come back to is you dig where the ground is soft. And so start practicing in an area where you feel like you can, I think are important. I put in the chat, so, but I'll say it out loud too. Just if anyone has anything they want to share about kind of what has like worked or not worked for them, we kind of welcome the comments, whether in the chat, or you are welcome to kind of signal that you want to speak, and we'll make space for that. But if, yeah, so feel free, I'll pause and like kind of do that if you have anything to add. And then otherwise, our next topic is kind of navigating expectations around boundary setting, right? Like, so how do I do that? Because there's a lot kind of in that space, I think, and also like pushback, right? How do I deal with I've set a boundary and like somebody's saying, no, let's do that anyway. Jesse, do you want to start with that space?
Absolutely. Probably the most challenging thing when working with clients is I have found is, okay, but what if they say this? What if they say this? What if they say this? So oftentimes we start creating a story of everything that could possibly happen once we start setting that boundary. And we get so discouraged because of the story we've now created, that this is the outcome that's going to happen. So I can't set these boundaries. So one of the things we have to acknowledge is I do not have control over this person's reactions. And as soon as we can accept that, my focus is how can I communicate this is what I need. So understand there's going to be pushback. Maybe they might push back. We love if our friends or family members or employers accept our boundaries, but that may not happen. You may get pushback, you may get anger, they may ignore it, or they may become defensive, or they may initially respect it and then they come back, well, can I get some clarification? What exactly do you mean when you said this? Is this, am I allowed to do this? Am I allowed to do that? And in a way, they're trying to peel away exactly, see what they can essentially not get away with, but what are you willing to tolerate and what are you not? So I think the first thing I would tell clients is you cannot control how they're going to react. Only thing you can control is how you communicate your needs.
That's so, that's probably the hardest thing, right? Like is letting go of how other people are going to respond, and the fact that like I actually have no control over that. I might have some influence, but there's no way to actually control it. Sharon or Nashra, any thoughts on that?
Sometimes I like to play the like, what's the worst thing that could happen game. I feel like that helps me a lot. Because I feel like I like exactly what Jesse's describing. I really get stuck in that like feedback loop of like, oh, well, they could say this and they could do this. And oh my God, they might totally freak out if I say this. So I love to do like, okay, what's the worst possible scenario? And then be like, oh, wait, that's really not that bad. Because usually the worst possible thing, once you put a name on it, at least for me, I feel like once I like verbalize it or put a name on it or write it down, it's not that scary anymore. And then I'm like, oh wait, I can totally do this. This is not actually that big of a deal. But like leaving it in my head and letting it snowball, that's what makes it scary.
I love that. And I think to add to that too, the more times that we do it, the easier it gets. Right. I mean, just practice. You have to keep practicing. I know, Nikki, you joked that you've been doing boundaries for 40 plus years. And so you're good at it, but it's hard for all of us. You know, I think that it just depends on who we're setting the boundary with. Right. It might be super easy with a friend or the spouse at some point. And then there's that boss that doesn't have boundaries, not talking about my boss. And so when you have somebody that doesn't have good boundaries, it's very hard. Right. And I feel like a lot with clients, we hear that about supervisors. Right. And I think that that's when you really want to do the reading and talk to your therapist or, you know, talk to folks and say, like, how have you done this? Especially with younger attorneys. Right. They feel like they have to do all the things and they don't really, unless someone is being an example to you, how do you then learn?
Use all your resources, right? Like that's it at the end of the day, depending on what you need. Because I think Sharon's point is great, is that different people push back in different ways. And some relationships feel more secure than others. I think that often makes a difference too, is kind of the security you have in the relationship. So there's a lot there. But I think the biggest piece connecting to that is it's still going to be uncomfortable, right? And at the crux kind of boundaries and like what we did this survey on kind of what prevents people from setting boundaries. And all the language at the end of the day not all of it, most of the language at the end of the day came back to some type of discomfort. Whether it was the discomfort of fear, whether the discomfort of like people pleasing, whether the discomfort of like excelling at work, but like all of it came back to like, oh, this thing might happen. And as Nashra was saying, right, like the worst case scenario, like playing out what that worst case scenario is. But we thought an important part of the conversation today is really talking about that discomfort and how to make space and room for the discomfort, our own and other people's, right? Because I'm going to feel uncomfortable and I'm probably going to feel some of what that other person is feeling. And how do I make room for all of those feelings? So maybe starting out with really just how do I navigate discomfort? Not get rid of, right? But navigate. And let's start with Nashra. How about that?
That is very hard for me, I'll be honest. I feel like I naturally am kind of a people pleaser. So, and I mean, I feel like a lot of lawyers are. I don't know if other people agree with that, but I feel like that's part of like the type A personality of the person that goes to law school. But I am such a people pleaser. So I'm the type of person to say yes to things and like agree to do things and like want to change things when actually that's like not really what works for my life most of the time. So I feel like I've really had to learn how to like be okay with if I don't say yes to something, it's okay if nobody else says yes either. Like I said earlier, like I work for a really small office. So sometimes like we're asked to do something and nobody volunteers. Like I'm the type of person that will be like, oh, nobody else is going to do it. I guess I can do it. But actually most of the time I can't. So learning how to be okay with that, I think is really, really difficult. It's something I work on every single day.
And I would say, you know what, I like the part where you say is, you know what, actually I don't, because I think that is part of it, is that short-term discomfort of no one's going to say something, so let me just jump in. But the thing about setting boundaries is about tolerating that short-term discomfort for your ultimate long-term goal. You know, one of the analogy I like to use with clients is thinking about when you are exercising and you're starting a new exercise routine. Those first few days or even weeks, your body is so uncomfortable. You're feeling tightness, you know, everything hurts. And you just want to say, you know what? I just want to go back and not work out. But if you keep working out and you keep working through that discomfort, eventually, yes, while it still hurts, it may not hurt the way it did those first few weeks of starting out. And boundaries is the same way. The more and more you exercise boundaries with your friends, family, coworkers, while you still may feel discomfort, it's not as bad and you're able to tolerate that discomfort.
I love that because in thinking about that when we were talking about this, right? I work out regularly. I go to the gym, I run, and I still will have days where I wake up and I'm like, oh, I probably did a lot today, right? Yesterday. But all I do is I notice it and then I move forward from it, right? Whereas when I often start kind of the exercise, you're just like, oh, I can't do this. This is too hard. How long is it going to last? Will it ever end? Whereas once you've done it, you kind of know, okay, it'll last this amount of time. Oh, if I drink some more water or I get a heating pad, like whatever it is, right? Like I know how to then navigate it where it's not kind of as terrifying and vast. When you're first starting out, they're like, I think there's a vastness to this. I'm like, will this discomfort end? How long is this going to go on? Am I always going to feel bad for saying no to this thing? Am I going to wake up in a month from now and be like, oh, I still should have said yes to it? And most often, right, it's no. Like your brain can't hold up that stuff. But so what, Jesse, I think that's a wonderful kind of metaphor comparison. One of the things we want to give a pause for in this moment is for the audience. We're going to pen, paper, document, whatever it is. Think about what are the costs of not setting the boundary? Because we're talking about, right, acute pain versus like long-term discomfort often. So what are the costs of not setting the boundary? Kind of what might make this boundary important? And kind of what would you be prioritizing, right? By not setting it, I'm prioritizing typically somebody else's comfort. And deprioritizing my own, but kind of in a more granular way, like literally, what would you be prioritizing, and kind of what are the costs of not setting the boundary? And I'm gonna give you like 30 seconds to think about it. Sharon, could you talk a little bit about, kind of still in the same discomfort space, but how do we like recognize where the discomfort's coming from, and like whether there's some like beliefs or thoughts or stories we're kind of telling ourselves?
Sure. I mean, I think what we were just talking about, right? Like the perfectionism, right? Like the type A personality type that we see a lot in certain professions. Also in the legal profession, it's a helping profession, right? And so people go into this profession wanting to give, wanting to do, and you know, saying no is not, it goes against like our identity, right? It's like, I am the helpful person, and if I say no, then who am I, right? And so I think really figuring out to your core, you can say no to something because you're saying yes to yourself, right? Like maybe you're giving yourself a little bit more energy so that you can then be there for your friend, right? Or even get more sleep that night, and then be there more for your clients because you're being there for yourself. And so it's really important to recognize also like what your feelings are about, right? Are you feeling guilty? Are you feeling disappointed in yourself? Sometimes also when you were talking about like setting the boundary, sometimes it's like the opposite. Like we're setting a boundary for ourselves because we aren't comfortable pushing back on someone else's boundary, right? And so it might be doing less as opposed to thinking proactively, what can I do ahead of time? And I think that happens a lot when there are situations where we know that person's not really going to give, right? It might be a client that you have to respond to. It might be a supervisor or an in-law or a parent, where you have to say yes because it's going to make your life a little bit easier. But hopefully that's not all the time.
So I've identified there's like a barrier, right? There's a barrier, whether it's feelings of guilt, whether it's like worry about what will my boss think, and will this impact my performance review? Whether it's I'm going to miss out on an opportunity that I think looks really interesting. You know, some of it can just be like the fun things, right? Like I just say yes to everything because I'm like, oh, if I don't do that, then I'm going to miss out on the opportunity. And then I'm going to feel sad that I missed out on the opportunity. But I also am now going to be exhausted because I have spent all of my time doing all of the opportunities. I've had no time to rest. Right. There's, for different people and in different settings, there's so many different reasons for these kind of barriers. So I've recognized the barrier. What more do I need to do, right? Like, how do I explore and kind of confront so I can start to shift, and then start identifying ways to like set the boundary? Does that make sense?
Yes, and I
Okay.
think it's kind of like that example where you're saying, where I want to be able to say yes, or I want to be able to go to these parties. I want to be able to be there for people, but recognizing, okay, if I say yes to all of this, what am I going to lose out? Okay, I'm not feel restful. So am I really going to be present in these moments? So it's one of the things is about acknowledging, okay, I'm going to make the intentional decision to miss out on this because I need the benefit of rest. Or I'm going to make the decision to tell this person that I can't help them this day, but I can help them this day because I want to be able to be fully present to be able to help you in that moment. So sometimes it's about shifting our focus. Like, I'm not saying no to this. I'm not saying yes to a no to this. I'm saying yes to this other things that I feel like I want more. So whether it's rest, whether it is I want to be able to be there for them, but in a different way. So instead of seeing it, oh, I'm missing out on this, I'm gaining this.
That's great. We have two kind of questions in the chat that I want to make sure to get to, but I also didn't want to end this part of the conversation. So just want to make sure Sharon or Nashra, you didn't have anything kind of you wanted to add to it. No. Okay, great. Awesome. And I'm going to start with the first one is essentially, so along the lines of stating your boundaries in advance, how do you respond when the person with whom you're trying to set a boundary says you're setting a particular boundary and it's being critical of them? So like their pushback, right, is like, you're criticizing me now. How do you kind of navigate that?
Well, just based on the question, I'm assuming that's probably a personal relationship, or it could be a very close workplace relationship. Is we have to be careful of words. So we make sure you're not saying, well, you identifying that person and shifting it back to, no, this is what I need because this is what I'm experiencing. And being able to express, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling, anger. What are you feeling? So that, and the reason I'm asking for this is because this is how the way things is affecting me. So that this way, it's not the person. I'm not being critical of you. This is what I need because this is how I'm being impacted. I have back-to-back meetings and I'm not able to take a break. And physically, I'm feeling exhausted. So if we can spread the meetings out with a 15-minute break, that will be helpful in the workplace example. So it's about just expressing how the lack of boundaries is impacting me. That could just be one way.
I was just going to add to that too. And thinking about it, like if it's a personal relationship, if the person is always deflecting essentially, and like, I think using I is really important. And if they're still taking it personally at some point, you kind of just have to stop because the boundary is for you, it's not for them. Right. And so if they're responding in that way, that's a deeper conversation, and please feel free to reach out to us. But I think it's really just important to remember that the boundaries is about you, not about them.
They'll have reactions, but they're yours, right? And it goes back to what Jesse was saying earlier, is like, we can't control other people's reactions, unfortunately, as much as we'd like to what those boundaries are. So if I might imagine it also comes back to just knowing for yourself, like Jesse is saying and Cher was saying, if I'm using language that I believe is not critical, I can, and I've done my best to kind of present it in a way, and maybe I check with somebody else, right? Like I call a friend, I call my therapist, I call whomever, and say, hey, like, this is how I presented it. Does that feel critical to you? Because sometimes we do need like reassurance and checking ourselves. And the person still continues to take it critically. We may need to let that go and not continue to try to adapt to them. But again, it all comes back to that individual relationship and kind of where we are and what we need. But I think not recognizing we cannot control other people's reactions is also really important. Anybody else for that space? No. Okay. Then the other one is circling way back. Jesse, I think you gave her the really kind of good example of in the very beginning about like skin being a boundary, right? Like it's flexible, but not rigid and not porous, right? So can anybody on here kind of talk a little bit, how do you find that like middle ground? How do I not over boundary and become very rigid? And how do I not just kind of let go and let anything happen? Like how do we know what is flexible, I guess?
I'm gonna first say one thing. You are going to make mistakes at times when setting the boundaries, especially if it's an established relationship. We typically may overcorrect at times or undercorrect or set the boundaries but then double step. So I think first thing is acknowledging when you're setting the boundary, there is going to be some missteps. So it's about finding that sweet spot. And it may be different in each relationship. So you have to be willing to really say, What is it that's been in this relationship, the situation that has been draining me, that has depleting me? And then assessing, what do I think I need? So if I have been allowing clients to call me at 7, 8 o'clock, okay, do I stop telling them, or they have to start at 3? That may be a little bit too much. Can I reset it to maybe, you know what? Between Monday and Friday, up to 6 o'clock, a client can call me. Friday, it may be 5 o'clock. So it's just finding that sweet spot that you feel comfortable with, but also recognizing if you overstep, can you reset?
Nasha, I'm wondering if you just like kind of your personal experience with that, right? You've talked about learning how to have to navigate boundaries. So like, how do you know kind of what that sweet spot is?
I don't, to answer the question totally honestly. I think that's something I struggle with all the time, is like figuring out what that sweet spot is for every situation in my life. And like realizing that every situation is totally different and that sweet spot looks different, maybe even for different clients, for different situations, for different types of relationships. Like, I guess going back to the client contact example, like there have been clients that I have allowed them to contact me at like hours that I don't usually take calls, or like I have agreed to like a weekend meeting or something like that when I'm not actually obligated to do that through my job. But sometimes that's what works better. Like for example, very recently I decided to schedule a client interview on a Saturday instead of a Friday. It was going to be super rushed on that Friday. And I like asked my boss if it was okay to just like move the hours around. So it worked out. It was a lot better. It was better for the client. It was better for me. And at the end of the day, I was less stressed because I was able to like spread out that like call that I had to take and like take as much time for it as I needed. So I feel like that sweet spot is very difficult to find. In the past, I might not have talked to my boss about it, and I might have just done that anyway and like not counted the hours and not like told anybody I was working on the weekend and like not been compensated for that. But I guess part of finding that sweet spot is just like figuring out what works and what doesn't, and like working with the people around you to figure that out as well. I hope that answers your question. This is something I struggle with a lot, so I don't think I have a great answer to it.
I actually think it was a great answer in that like we're all figuring it, right? Like we all are figuring it out as we go. But I actually think that's information, right? So one, I think a flexible boundary, like the sweet spot, is one that is adaptable, but it's adaptable infrequent, right? Like it's not like I'm not like if every day or every week I'm like changing the boundary, maybe that might actually be too porous. But if it's like, oh, well, their exceptions do come up and I'm willing to adapt for that is probably like some level of sweet spot. I was joking, this is like last year, I was presenting to a UDC class and it was in the evening and it happened to be on my husband's birthday. But that was typically my boundaries are like, I try to be home with the kids in the evening and I probably wouldn't like schedule it on my husband's birthday. But they had offered me 4 days. None of the other days worked for his schedule. So I was like, well, I'm going to do it on your birthday. And I'm going to do it in the evening because I really love talking to students, right? So my typical boundary is I'm done by 5 and family time is the evening time. But my flexibleness was my priority is I really enjoy spending time with students. I really enjoy like educating them on mental health stuff. So I'm willing to like flex that, right? But if every week I'm like, oh, actually, I'm now working till like 7 o'clock and I say that my priorities, my family, like seeing the kids for dinner, let's say, but I'm missing dinner regularly, then like that's a porous boundary. Or on the flip side, the like rigidness would be, I never work after 5 o'clock. And this request came in. And even though I really love spending like time educating law students, I'm unwilling to do it no matter what. That might be a little too strict because I am not allowing something I find of value, any kind of space in my life. I guess so. It's just thinking about, and it's different for everybody, right? Like that's just a silly little example, but it's thinking about those for you. And I would think about like frequency of which you can adapt is one of them, maybe two. Okay, I think we have, there's some, sorry, I'm scrolling through the chat because there was something else somebody mentioned I wanted to make sure to get to it. one of the things somebody commented on was boundaries are often what we do rather than what we say, right? So one, I guess that's a question I'm putting to the like panelists, right? Are boundaries also often what we do rather than what we say? Yes or no?
I'll give the lawyerly answer. It depends. But obviously, yes, right? I mean, it depends upon the person. It depends upon the situation. But I think that going off of what you guys were just saying, our boundaries can change depending upon the season, the day, the month, right? Like the situation. And it's much easier. I was looking at Matt's comment in the chat. It's much easier to communicate a boundary if that person has boundaries, right? If you're feeling like you need to explain yourself more and more, or you're feeling that discomfort, it might be because it's not a safe person to maybe start with, right? So that's important to remember as well.
I think that was really good points. And the boundaries are both verbal and nonverbal, right? Like they are actions and they are words. Sometimes we need words. Sometimes, though, they're actions. Nashra, you talked about earlier, one of your boundaried actions was like not volunteering. It was just staying silent, right? Like somebody asked, can you do this? Never communicated a boundary verbally at all. And yet you said a really clear boundary thing, right? You're just like, I'm not doing that. So I do think it's important to think about both, right? We do sometimes need to verbally communicate them, but often we can actually communicate them in ways by how we respond or act or say yes or say don't say yes, you know, ways we do things, leaving conversations, whatever they may be.
And the one thing, I'm sorry, Nick, I just want to always highlight to people, boundaries can also be saying no to something. That could be a boundary. You don't always have to have a full explanation. My boundary can be, I'm saying no to this.
Yep.
And that's it.
Complete sentence. Yep. I think that's great. And I'm like, it's 2:59. We, you know, still didn't get through all the things that we wanted to get through because boundaries, you could talk about boundaries like endlessly. But we are available if you want to talk about this more. I will send out the recording and some good some resources. We'll send out some books and some other resources that I think could be really helpful. But please kind of know that everybody struggles with this, as you heard all of us kind of talk about, right? And no matter how, no matter what life throws at you, there will always be something that is that challenges kind of your boundaries. So please, again, don't hesitate to reach out. I'm gonna leave it with Denise put some information in the chat. And then I want to thank my panelists because they were wonderful. And if they have anything left to say, I'm going to give them the last minute.
No, I think you said it. We all work on it and we all get it wrong sometimes, but sometimes we get it right. Just keep using that muscle.